The first part of the table that I was going to build was the top, which I wanted to be about 700mm wide by 400 to 450mm deep. So these are the four pieces just straight off the jointer. They look fantastic. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a contrasting strip in the middle, and I'm going to use some beautiful red hardwood that I've got here as well. So this is that piece of hardwood that I have, and if you look at the colour on the end, it's a beautiful deep red colour. What I'll do is I'm just going to cut this up until I get solid timber, and then I'll cut a piece at 700. With one face and one edge flattened on the jointer and 90 degrees to each other. I could use those two surfaces to reference off on the table saw to cut all the boards to width and trim up that third edge. I've got the 5 pieces now dressed and squared on 3 sides, and they're just sitting together there. Thought of one problem though. Like I said, this table's for my mum, and she actually wanted to be able to move this table around. And what I've realised is already the top just on its own is I think way too heavy for her. So again, by the time I make a base and put legs on this thing, she won't be able to lift it. What I'm going to do is the boards are about 35 to 40mm thick at the moment. I'm actually going to rip them down on the table saw to 25mm. I'm also thinking that I might make the top and the legs 2 separate pieces so that she can move them around separately. I had a slight change of design, and I split that contrast piece into 2 thinner strips. Next is glue up the top. I decided to join the pieces together using biscuit joints, but I didn't cut the biscuits in the centre of the edge. I cut them towards one side, which is the top side, and I have a feeling that this contributed to some cupping issues, as you'll see later. The tabletop's been a bit of a failure. The bowing or the cupping in that top is so significant that it's basically unusable the way it is. I'm not quite sure why it occurred. The best thing to do is just to get on and fix it. The only solution that I can see is to re-saw it and dress it on the jointer and re-glue it again. And here is the second attempt at gluing up the top. Well, I've just pulled the tabletop out of the clamps, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give it some bit of a first sand with the belt sander and some 120, and then later on finish it off with some fine sanding. So after re-gluing the top, I just trimmed off the edges again on the table saw using the sled, just to flatten it off and get it straight. And then I just rounded over all the edges using a trim router and a 5mm round over bit. The next part of the table to make up now is just the apron pieces that are going to go between the legs.
and I'm just going to make them out of this, it's like a 1x4 hardwood, again reclaimed hardwood, so I'll cut up the pieces of that and dress it.
Once the pieces were dressed, I took them over to the table saw and just squared off one end, and then using a stop block I cut the two side pieces and then the two front pieces to length.
So I'm going to use the table saw and the sled to cut the tenons on the ends of these apron pieces. So each tenon is 25mm long. So what I've done is I've set my fence to 25mm from the fence to this side of the blade, and what I'm going to do now is the tenon will be approximately half the thickness of the stock. So the piece of timber is about 24mm, so I want to end up with a tenon about 12mm. So what I'll do now is set the height of the blade to 6mm, just above the surface of the sled. When I was measuring up these apron pieces to work out the cut depth for the second face of the tenon, they weren't all the same thickness. Now I had a feeling that would happen because I didn't run it through a thickness planer because I don't have one. But I wasn't too concerned about that because once these apron pieces are in place, no one's ever going to notice the difference in thickness of a couple of millimeters, and these were between 23 and 25mm. So normally what I would have done to cut that second face of the tenon, I would have just turned it over in my sled and ran it over the blade again. So what that meant was that basically I just had to reference off the same face. And the simple solution to that was basically to use my tenoning jig and mounting the board with that face against the jig. And I've set the blade at the right measurement, so I end up with a 12mm tenon. And by putting all the boards in this way, it doesn't really matter about the thickness of the board, the tenon will always be the same size.
The next part of the table to make now was the legs, which I was going to make up out of these old hardwood fence rails. Once again, after flattening one face and one edge on the joint and making sure they are 90 degrees to each other, I could then use those two surfaces to reference off on the table saw to cut the legs to their final width and dress up that third edge. Then I just cut the leg pieces to length using a stop block on the sled.
Just as a little bit of a feature on these legs, I'm going to cut a taper on one edge of each leg, being this unfinished edge here. Now the two front legs, the inside edge facing each other, will have the taper, and the same for the two back legs. To cut that taper, I'm going to use my old faithful, the saw milling jig. Yeah, it's good to be able to use this jig again. This, for those of you who are following me, you would have seen me actually build the jig and use it to make the outdoor table, and I'll post links to those videos so those of you who haven't seen them can see them. But yeah, this is a fantastic jig, and like I said, it's great to be able to use it again. One thing I've always found when working with this really old and well seasoned hardwood is that when you cut it in certain directions, the grain sort of separates and it becomes really rough, and it's got some quite sharp edges and splinters and things. Now, as you see there, although that splitting of the grain is part of the charm of using this old timber, because it looks quite good actually, in some areas, yeah, like I said, it can be very sharp. So what I've been doing is actually filling the grain with wood glue. Now, the reason for it is not to actually fill the grain, but more to stabilize the grain so that it won't split or separate anymore. And basically it's fairly simple. Just put on a whole heap of glue, and then just using some sort of any type of scraper, I scrape the glue and just basically squeeze it into the grain, working against the grain. Try not to make too much of a mess. And as you can see there, that fills that grain quite nicely. And then once you're happy that you've squeezed a lot of glue into that grain, then it's just a matter of basically wiping it off. Okay, so it's only been a couple of minutes and that surface water has dried off that timber. And as you can see, you can't see the glue at all. There's no staining of the surface. And that's not the finished surface of the leg either. These legs still require finish sanding. So that's going to clean up that surface even more. On one of these legs, I've got a couple of fairly big voids in the timber. And I've got one there as well, fairly sizable one too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually fill these with resin. And that one there's okay, that'll contain itself. But this one here, because it was on the edge, what I've done is that's just a piece of grease-proof paper there. And then I've just clamped a block to form like a little bit of a barrier there.
I used a flush trim bit to remove most of the resin before sanding, and I used that masking tape there because I wanted to leave the resin slightly proud of the surface, but then I realised I didn't need to, so I just removed it, finished it off, and then gave it a sand on the belt sander. Next was to cut the mortises in the legs to take the apron pieces, and I decided to do that with the router bit.
Well, I've had a slight mishap. My router bit just snapped, and I haven't finished cutting those mortises yet. So I'm not sure if I have another one. Okay, so I found another router bit. I had an older one in the drawer. It's a slightly bigger one though. That first one was a 6mm, this is an 8mm. So I've just adjusted the fence, and I'll finish cutting these mortises.
I ended up adding a second fence here, as you can see, just to make sure that those leg pieces stayed secure and true while I was routing them.
Well, I knew this old reclaimed hardwood was pretty tough, but who'd have thought I'd go through 2 router bits. So it looks like I'm going to have to purchase a new one after all. Okay, so I got the new router bit. There it is there. Went for a slightly bigger size. This is a 10mm 3/8 straight cut bit. I thought if I get a bigger one, it'll put a bit less strain on the bit. But in hindsight, to be quite honest, it's probably my fault. I went through those other bits because I should have used the drill press and drilled out the majority of the stock before I cut the mortises with the router bit. Anyway, I'll get this in the machine and we'll finish off these the mortises in these legs. Okay, I've just put the table together, sorry, the base together in a dry fit, and it's looking pretty good. Pretty happy with the way it's turned out. So the next thing to do is I'm just going to round off all the corners with a little 5mm round over bit. So the last thing to do on this table before I apply the finish coat is to just add a couple of little blocks in the corners on the underside of the tabletop. As I mentioned before, this table's a gift for my mum, and she wants to be able to move it from inside the house to outside, and I was concerned about the weight of the table. So what I'm going to do is to leave it as two pieces, so the legs and the top are going to be separate pieces. So just to help her locate the top onto the legs, I'm going to add a couple of small corner blocks. Yeah, so as you can see, I've just made up those little corner blocks. Going to glue and screw them to the underside of the tabletop. And if I just move this leg out of the way, you can see there that I've just marked the corners of where I want the blocks to go.
I position these locating blocks in place and then use the drill just to mark the underside of the tabletop surface, which would allow me to come back later and know where to drill the pilot hole for the screw. You'll notice on the tabletop there's been yet another design change. I was actually still getting cupping in that middle joint in the tabletop. So what I did was I resawed it to eliminate the biscuit joints and added that third contrasting strip in the middle, which I think looks better anyway. After that, all that was left to do was to finish it, which I did with some clear polyurethane.